My name is Sandeep Jauhar. I'm a doctor, a cardiologist, and the author of the memoir, My Father's Brain, Life in the Shadow of Alzheimer's. My brother and I were living in New York. We're both doctors. My sister was living in Minneapolis. We started to get unmistakable signs that my parents needed help. My mother actually had Parkinson's disease. And so we were focused on her and kind of ignoring some troubling signs from my father, who did a pretty good job hiding his cognitive decline. But when they finally moved to New York, which was a move that my father said was purely for my mother because of her illness, it was very clear that my father was declining rapidly. Would tell the same story over and over again, typical Alzheimer's type of behavior. He would forget what he'd had for lunch. He kept forgetting the code to the new safe that we bought for him. It was my mother's birth year, 1941. He couldn't sort of navigate around town. My mother was sort of in denial. My father was definitely in denial. He didn't see what we were worried about. I would say, Dad, do you think your memory's changing? Do you think? He's like, yeah, but that's what happens when you get older. It happens with everyone. It's totally normal. But it was actually my mother who finally was telling me this story of how my father got lost one day with her in the car and stopped the car on a busy road and tried to flag down, passing motorists to ask how to get home. And then she was the first to say, do you think your father has Alzheimer's? And, Alzheimer's is like a bad word, right? No one wants to think that their family member has it. But she actually was the one who told me and my brother to take my father to a neurologist, and we did. And that's when he was diagnosed with a sort of pre-dementia called mild cognitive impairment. But the neurologist made it clear that these were the early stages. It wasn't even that early at that point of Alzheimer's disease. I didn't know that much about Alzheimer's. So for me, as a doctor, as someone who's scientifically minded or believes in the power of rational thought to navigate troubling situations, I invested myself into learning as much as I could about the disease. And I had gone through medical school and had been exposed to neurologists, taken neurology classes, done neurology rotations, but I was, in retrospect, totally unequipped to handle what was going on with my father. I had to learn not just about behavioral manifestations, whatever, but actually learn the neurobiology of the disease, which is what I write about in my book. The psychology, the philosophy, the experience, the family experience. People get very impatient when they're taking care of someone with Alzheimer's. It's an incredibly frustrating disease, especially when you're used to a certain kind of behavior from your loved one, and then they start to change or they start to ask the same question over and over again. It was very frustrating when my father would say, there's nothing wrong with me. I can take care of myself. And he was leaving the stove on, and he kept kicking out caregivers that we hired to help take care of him. The central thing for me was to learn about the disease, partly because it's just a fascinating disease. It's the emperor of all brain diseases, but also just to help me be a better caregiver. I was with my father very rationally minded, and I didn't understand why he was behaving the way he was. And in a sense, he was a prisoner of his declining, decaying mind. But I was also a prisoner of my mind. My mother died. My father would forget that she had died. And I would tell him she had died because I thought that was the only way to be with him. Say, look, she died. I didn't want to solidify his misconceptions, but they were comforting deceptions, that my wife is still alive. And my siblings would disagree with me and say, no, it's okay to say, okay, like mom's just out right now and she'll be back. And I had a very hard time accepting that it took a while, but I eventually understood that kind of validation therapy, if you will, is the most humane way to deal with someone who has declining memory. Because when you tell them an uncomfortable truth, you cause them pain, it's not like you're causing it once. They forget, and then you have to remind them again and again. It ends up being, just a horrible cycle. Another big thing I learned was about end of life care, sort of ethical conundra when it comes to someone like my father, who had explicitly said that he never wanted to have any extraordinary measures done to keep himself alive when he was nearing the end, if he had a serious illness, which would argue for adopting a more palliative approach, which is what we started doing with my father when he was near the end. But he seemingly had changed his mind. He wanted to live. We can never know what we're going to think at life's final chapter. When it came time, he was very clear that he wasn't that unhappy having Alzheimer's. He was, he was enjoying life's simple pleasures. And we thought that was below his dignity. He was a very accomplished scientist. So for us, him just enjoying some ice cream, my brother would say he's like a child. It's hard not to think that way, but that's part of the discrimination that we practice against people who are, losing their minds to dementia. He suddenly took a turn for the worse. I had taken him out to lunch, and a couple of days later, he couldn't get out of bed, and he essentially never got out of bed after that. So what happened? I understood that he had a terminal illness, and eventually things were going to take a turn, but I still wanted to know what happened. Does he have a urinary tract infection? Does he has he had a stroke? Does he have COVID during the pandemic? And my brother would say it doesn't really matter, because if we give him antibiotics, we're not reversing this decline. And then I would argue, but he wasn't that unhappy. What right do we have to say, this is your time? And my brother would say, it's not us saying it, it's Dad said it in the letter he wrote 20 years ago. And my brother said that this is in compliance with his wishes. But I struggled with that. I said, is it compliance with the dad 20 years ago or the dad today? The dad today doesn't seem to remember anything of what he said. And he seems to be not that unhappy with just existing the way he is. So what right do we have to not give him antibiotics and not give him fluids? And it was very difficult. That was the most difficult thing. What was helpful for my family is that we stood together. We had conflicts and disagreements, but we fundamentally didn't want to compromise the family unit. Try to find common ground. I think that's important. The other thing is to learn as much as you can about the disease, whether it means, reading my book or just talking to doctors, but you need to have an understanding of what it is that you're going to be facing. I would say before someone gets sick, they should really assign a healthcare proxy. I think that's more effective than an advance directive, because with advance directives, you could never predict the nuances of a future experience. So I think it's important to have a healthcare proxy with whom you share your overall wishes so that they can make informed decisions near the end.